The wooden mallet hits the bench with a sound like a bone snapping in a silent room. Elena Vance doesn't flinch. She just stares at the dust motes dancing in the harsh fluorescent light of the Rockingham County Superior Court. Outside, it is a crisp Tuesday in October 1987, but inside this room, the air is thick with the smell of floor wax and stale coffee. Elena is 17 years old. She is wearing a teal blazer with shoulder pads so wide they make her look like a child playing dress-up in her mother's closet. Her hair is a rigid, permed crown of blonde, held in place by a half can of Aquanet hairspray. She looks like every other girl in the Northbrook High yearbook, but today she isn't a student. She is the first test case for a nation that has decided it is finished with mercy. Before we peel back the layers of this visceral investigation and uncover the truth behind the girl they called the Ice Princess, hit that subscribe button. Turn on your notifications so you never miss a deep dive into the vault of the Justice Minute. We are uncovering the dark side of the 80s, and you do not want to be left in the dark. The trial of Elena Vance didn't just capture the headlines, it became a defining moment of visual justice. For the first time in this jurisdiction, the state legislature has authorized an 18-month experimental window for electronic coverage of court proceedings. That means there are cameras here. Clunky, static position boxes with thick black cables snaking across the mahogany floors like sleeping pythons. Elena is no longer just a defendant. She is a televised object. Every time she blinks, every time she adjusts her glasses, it is broadcast into living rooms across the state on wood-paneled console televisions. The prosecutor, a man who looks like he was born in a three-piece suit, stands before the jury. He doesn't look at Elena. He looks at the camera. He knows that in 1987, the court of public opinion is just as powerful as the one presided over by the judge. He begins his opening statement by invoking the new federal sentencing guidelines that took effect on November 1st of this year. These rules were designed to be tough. They were designed to abolish parole and establish a rigid range of punishment for every coordination of offense. The prosecutor tells the jury that Elena Vance is a cold-blooded actor. He says she is a girl who traded her pom-poms for a blunt object. Elena's defense attorney, a weary-looking man with a tobacco-stained mustache, tries to lean into judicial paternalism. He wants the jury to see a girl, not a monster. He tries to trigger those traditional norms of chivalry, hoping the sight of a 17-year-old girl in a pastel blazer will make the jury hesitate. But the prosecution has a counter-strategy. They are using the evil woman hypothesis. They argue that by allegedly committing this homicide, Elena hasn't just broken the law, she has violated every norm of passive femininity. They don't see a child, they see a super predator in a neon sweatshirt. The tension in the room is high-key. You can hear the rhythmic hum of the heavy-duty ventilation system and the distant thump-thump of a construction crew working on the street outside. The jurors look at Elena, then at the evidence bags on the table. And inside one of those bags is a neon pink Esprit sweatshirt, the kind of aspirational brand every middle-class teenager in 1987 begged their parents for at the mall. But this sweatshirt is different. It is stained. This story begins here, in this wood-paneled arena of performance and procedure. But to understand how a high school senior ended up facing a life sentence in an adult penitentiary, we have to go back to the sweltering, humid night of August 14th. It was a night filled with the sound of cicadas and the smell of damp pine needles at Blackwood Lake. A night where the best-selling car in America, a white Ford Escort, became a mobile crime scene. The public is fascinated because Elena Vance looks like she belongs in a John Hughes movie, not a jail cell. She was a girl from an idyllic neighborhood who supposedly snapped. But as the trial begins, we realize that the legal system is struggling to incorporate new findings about the teenage brain. In 1987, the world viewed 17 as not old enough to vote, but old enough to die in a cage. The shift from rehabilitation to retribution is happening right now, in real time, under the flicker of those experimental television lights. The judge cracks his gavel again, calling for the first witness. This is the moment where the mundane aspects of litigation are stripped away, leaving only the human tension. The prosecution is ready to present their star witness. A microcassette tape from a Tandy duophone answering machine. A voice from the grave captured in the crackle of magnetic tape and the clink of coins from a payphone. As we sit in this courtroom, watching the managed face of Elena Vance, we have to ask, is she the villain the nightly news says she is? Or is she a victim of a system that decided to get tough on crime at the exact moment she needed protection? The rules have changed. The era of the super predator has arrived. And for Elena, there is no reset button. Stay with me. Because what happened at the docks of Blackwood Lake isn't just a homicide case. It is a referendum on a generation. It is a story of early forensic science, a neon pink sweatshirt, and a secret that has been buried under the static of a 1987 summer for too long. The jury is watching, the cameras are rolling, and the girl in the teal blazer is about to have her life dismantled, piece by piece, before a national audience. This is not just a trial, and this is a spectacle. This is not old enough, but guilty. To understand the tragedy of Blackwood Lake, you have to understand the world of 1987. It was a year defined by extreme political strife and a domestic obsession with social order. While the radio played the upbeat rhythms of Whitney Houston's "I Want to Dance with Somebody," a darker current was moving through the American suburbs. Public anxiety regarding violent crime was reaching a fever pitch, fueled by a news cycle where 30% of stories were focused on deviance and disorder. This was the era of the super predator myth, a time when the nation decided that the only way to protect its children was to treat its most troubled youth like hardened adults. Northbrook was the epicenter of this suburban anxiety. It was a town of manicured lawns, two-car garages, and a rigid social hierarchy that was enforced as strictly as any legal code. In the summer of 1987, Northbrook was sweltering under an oppressive heat wave that made the air feel like a physical weight. The sensory landscape was a mix of the rhythmic buzzing of cicadas, the sharp chemical smell of Aquanet hairspray, and the distant tinny sound of top 40 radio drifting from backyard pool parties. At the center of this world was Elena Vance. To her classmates at Northbrook High, she was the definition of choice. She was a 17-year-old senior who navigated the hallways with a quiet, managed confidence. Elena was a mall rat in the most aspirational sense. She spent her weekends at the Northbrook Mall, a neon-lit cathedral of consumerism where the smell of cinnamon rolls from the food court mingled with the heavy, floral scents of department store perfume counters. This was where she bought the most significant item in this case, a neon pink Esprit sweatshirt. In 1987, brands like Esprit, Benetton, and Guess weren't just clothes. They were social armor. They signaled a belonging to the preppy elite, a status that suggested you were safe, protected, and above suspicion. Elena's daily life was synchronized with the technology of the era. She drove a white 1987 Ford Escort, the best-selling car in the United States that year. The interior smelled of spilled diet soda and the vanilla-scented air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. And on the passenger seat sat a collection of dubbed cassette tapes with handwritten labels. When she wasn't at school, she was at home, where the red light of the Tandy duophone answering machine was the heartbeat of the kitchen. This was a world of microcassettes and analog connections, where a missed call meant a message lost in the magnetic tape, and every interaction felt immediate yet fragile. But 1987 also had an underside that the manicured lawns of Northbrook tried to hide. While the town celebrated its pastoral peace, the media was saturated with moral panics. The satanic panic was in full swing, with talk shows featuring guests who shared unverified stories of clandestine cults. The war on drugs was intensifying, and the juvenile justice system was moving away from a model of rehabilitation toward one of deterrence. This shift meant that if you stepped out of line, the system wasn't there to catch you, it was there to crush you. If you're finding this deep dive into the culture of 1987 fascinating, do me a favor and hit that like button. It sends a signal to the YouTube algorithm that this investigation is worth sharing, and it helps us keep these deep vault stories coming your way. Marcus Thorne stood on the opposite side of that social line. 19 years old and a high school dropout, Marcus was viewed by the Northbrook elite as a wastoid, a term used to describe those who were seen as going nowhere. He lived in a cramped apartment on the edge of the industrial district and drove a fading 1986 Chevrolet Celebrity. While Elena's world was one of neon pink and pastel blazers, Marcus's world was defined by the grit of blue-collar reality. He was the thug the town feared, the archetype the prosecutor would eventually use to build a narrative of a dangerous influence leading a good girl astray. The tension between these two worlds was a powder keg waiting for a spark. In 1987, the preppy murder of Jennifer Levin in Central Park was still fresh in the public legal consciousness. The media had turned that case into a trial-by-media circus, emphasizing the sexual history and social status of everyone involved. Northbrook was watching, and the fear was not just psychological, it was a socioeconomic factor that reduced the quality of life. People were mistrustful of strangers, saw danger in every shadow, and restricted their social activities. They were waiting for a monster to appear in their own backyard so they could prove they were tough on crime. On the night of August 14, that spark was finally lit. The heat was so heavy it felt like it might snap the power lines. The cicadas were deafening. Elena Vance climbed into her white Ford Escort, adjusted her glasses, and backed out of her driveway. She wasn't just driving to the lake. She was driving toward a collision between the preppy perfection of her life and the retributive reality of a legal system that was finished with childhood. In a world before digital tracking and instant data, the events of that night would be reconstructed through the limited power of ABO blood grouping and the haunting static of an answering machine. The stage was set for a spectacle of visual justice, where the color of a sweatshirt and the managed face of a 17-year-old girl would become the evidence that defined a generation. August 14, 1987, was a night when the air itself felt like a threat. It was the height of a record-breaking heat wave that had turned the suburban sprawl of Northbrook into an oven. Even at 11 o'clock at night, the temperature refused to drop. The humidity hung low over the asphalt, thick enough to taste. In the Vance household, the only sound was the rhythmic hum of a window air conditioning unit struggling against the sweltering dark. Elena Vance moved through her bedroom with the practiced silence of a girl who had spent years learning how to avoid detection. She pulled on a pair of high-waisted acid-wash Guess jeans, the denim stiff and heavy against her skin. Over them, she tossed her prized possession, an oversized neon pink Esprit sweatshirt. It was a choice that made no sense for a heat wave, but for a 17-year-old girl in 1987, the brand was more important than the weather. She grabbed her keys, slipped out the window, and climbed into her father's white 1987 Ford Escort. We are about to enter the most intense part of Elena's story. If you're a fan of deep vault true crime and want to see more cases from the analog era, make sure you've hit that subscribe button. We release new investigations every week, and you don't want to be left behind. The drive to Blackwood Lake was a journey through a landscape of shadows and neon. Elena slid a cassette tape into the deck, a dubbed copy of George Michael's Faith that she'd recorded off the radio. The interior of the Escort smelled like a mix of spilled diet soda and the vanilla-scented air freshener hanging from the mirror. As she drove, the radio played a steady stream of top 40 hits, but Elena wasn't listening. She was focused on the road, her hands tight on the steering wheel, her eyes scanning the dark for any sign of her father's department cruiser. Blackwood Lake was the designated escape for the youth of Northbrook. It was a place where the rules of the suburbs seemed to dissolve. On the night of August 14th, the lakefront was alive with the sound of cicadas and the distant thump-thump of a bass-heavy track from a nearby boombox. The smell of damp pine needles and charcoal grills from earlier that evening lingered in the air. Elena parked the Escort near the boathouse, the tires crunching on the gravel. Waiting for her near the docks was Marcus Thorne. He was leaning against his 1986 Chevrolet Celebrity, the metal of the hood still warm from the drive. Marcus was the kind of guy the parents in Northbrook warned their daughters about. He was a wastoid, a dropout, someone who didn't belong in the preppy social hierarchy. But for Elena, Marcus was a lifeline. Their relationship was a dysfunctional attachment, a connection fueled by a shared sense of isolation. The confrontation began near the edge of the boathouse around 11:30. Witnesses later described a scene of chaotic energy. The orange glow of a nearby bonfire flickered against the reeds, casting long, distorted shadows across the water. The air was thick with the scent of stagnant lake water and the metallic tang of fear. The argument wasn't about anything specific. It was a release of the human tension that had been building all summer. Suddenly, the sounds changed. The rhythmic buzzing of the insects was punctuated by the sharp crunch of gravel under sneakers and the raised pitch of a voice that sounded like it was breaking. There was a struggle, a frantic, desperate movement in the dark. Elena's pink sweatshirt was a flash of neon against the blackness of the trees, and then came the sound that would haunt Northbrook for years, a heavy splash. The water of Blackwood Lake was dark and unforgiving. Marcus Thorne went under, and for a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the wind through the reeds and the distant music from the boombox. Elena stood on the edge of the dock, her neon pink sweatshirt reflecting the orange light of the fire. She wasn't a super predator in that moment. She was a terrified 17-year-old girl caught in a drama she couldn't control. What do you think was going through Elena's mind as she stood on that dock? Was it cold-blooded intent or a tragic mistake? I want to hear your theories. Drop a comment below and let's discuss the evidence. Elena didn't call for help. She didn't stay to see if Marcus would surface. She turned and ran back to the white Ford Escort, and the engine turned over with a mechanical whine that sounded like a scream in the quiet of the lakefront. She backed out of the gravel lot, her tires spitting stones, and disappeared into the night. She arrived home just after midnight. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. She crept into the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The only light in the room came from the blinking red light of the Tandy Duophone answering machine sitting on the counter. It was a slow, steady pulse, a digital heartbeat in the dark. She pressed the play button. The microcassette whirred to life. The sound of the magnetic tape spinning filled the kitchen. There was a burst of static, then the clink of coins hitting the bottom of a payphone. A voice came through the speaker, distorted, punctuated by the background noise of traffic. It was Marcus. He had called her just minutes before the confrontation. His voice was thick with emotion, his words tumbling over each other. "Elena, I'm at the lake. You have to come. We have to finish this." The tape ended with a sharp click as the machine reset. Elena stood in the dark kitchen, the neon pink sweatshirt now a duller shade in the low light. She didn't know that this microcassette would become one of the most significant pieces of physical evidence in a trial that would define her generation. She didn't know that the genetic panopticon of early DNA profiling was about to turn her clothes into a silent witness. As she stood there, the reality of the night began to settle. Marcus Thorne was dead. The pastoral peace of Northbrook was shattered. And for Elena Vance, and the transition from a child to a defendant was already complete. The sweltering heat of August 14 was over, but the fire of the investigation was just beginning to burn. The morning of August 15, 1987, broke with a heavy, sickly sweet mist clinging to the surface of Blackwood Lake. The heat wave hadn't broken. It had simply settled into a stagnant, humid haze. At 6:15 in the morning, a four-man rowing crew from the local athletic club pushed their shell into the water. They were looking for the calm of the early hour, but what they found instead was a permanent fracture in the peace of Northbrook. Marcus Thorne was found face down in the reeds, his body partially submerged near the north end of the docks. The scene was visceral. His skin was pale against the dark, murky water, and his 1986 Chevrolet Celebrity was still parked 50 yards away, a silent sentry on the gravel. One of the rowers scrambled to a nearby bait shop to find a payphone. In 1987, the emergency response system was a patchwork of analog frustration. The call was routed to a public safety answering point that served 3 different townships. Because the enhanced 911 network was still in its infancy, the dispatcher couldn't see the caller's location on a screen. They had to ask, verify, and manually check hand-drawn maps pinned to the wall. There was a delay, an agonizing stretch of minutes where the rowers stood over the body, the only sound being the rhythmic slap of the lake against the wooden pilings. When the Northbrook police and the county sheriff finally arrived, where the jurisdictional friction was immediate. This was the late analog era, a time before communications interoperability. The 2 agencies were on different radio frequencies, unable to talk to each other directly. They had to relay messages through a central dispatcher, a process that felt like a deadly game of telephone. Detectives moved through the scene with 35mm cameras, the pop flash of the bulbs punctuating the morning fog. They weren't looking at computer screens. They were taking notes on yellow legal pads and placing physical evidence into paper bags. The investigation moved at the speed of a teletype machine. To check Marcus Thorne's criminal history, a detective had to type a request into a terminal and wait for the clattering printer to spit out a response from the state repository. It could take hours, sometimes days, to get a clear picture of a victim's background. The paper trail was literal, a mountain of faxes and carbon copy reports that had to be hand-filed in metal cabinets. By noon, the detectives had found the first lead, a set of tire tracks in the gravel that didn't match Marcus's Chevy. They were narrow, consistent with a compact car. They also found a fragment of plastic, a piece of a light housing from a white 1987 Ford Escort. While the police were sifting through gravel, the community of Northbrook was spiraling into a moral panic. The news of the lakefront homicide spread not through social media, but through landline telephone chains and neighbors, whispering over backyard fences. The fear of crime in 1987 was a socioeconomic weight. The people were nearly twice as likely to suffer from depression when they felt their pastoral peace was under threat. The media didn't help. Local news outlets, desperate for ratings, began to frame the story using the theory of cultivation, suggesting that a thug like Marcus Thorne had brought the violence of the city into the suburbs. But the narrative shifted when a witness came forward. A teenager who had been at the bonfire reported seeing a flash of neon pink near the boathouse around 11:30. They remembered a white Ford Escort peeling out of the lot, the engine whining as it hit the main road. Detectives didn't have a database of license plates to scan. They had to do the boots on the groundwork. They spent the next 24 hours visiting every household in Northbrook that had a white Escort registered. When they pulled into the driveway of the Vance home on August 16th, they didn't expect to find a suspect. They expected to find a choice suburban family. Instead, they found Elena. She was sitting on the front porch, her managed face a mask of teenage indifference. But the detectives noticed something immediate. The white Ford Escort in the driveway had a cracked passenger side blinker, and hanging on a clothesline in the backyard, still damp from a frantic wash, was a neon pink Esprit sweatshirt. The interrogation that followed was a study in 1987 communication protocols. Elena was brought to a sterile, soundproofed room with solid core masonry walls. There was no digital recording. Instead, a Panasonic portable cassette recorder sat on the table between Elena and the lead detective. When the hiss of the magnetic tape filled the silences, Elena used what sociolinguists call powerless language. She spoke in hesitations, her voice rising at the end of sentences as if she were asking for permission. She told the detectives she had pushed him away because he was being weird. She claimed she didn't know he had fallen into the water. She thought he had just stepped off the dock, but the detectives were trained to look for inconsistencies. They leveraged her anxiety, pointing out that Marcus Thorne's voice had been captured on her answering machine just minutes before he died. In the late 80s, a microcassette was a haunting present-tense component. It made the victim feel alive in the room. They played the tape for her, the clink of the coins, the distorted voice of Marcus Thorne. Elena broke. She didn't confess to murder, but she admitted she was there. That was all they needed. Under the new sentencing guidelines, the severity of the act outweighed her age. The prosecutor, seeing the media circus already forming, made a choice. He wouldn't file the case in juvenile court. He invoked prosecutorial discretion. Elena Vance would be tried as an adult. As the sun set on August 16th, Elena was photographed for her mugshot. The flash of the camera was the last thing she saw before the heavy steel door of the county lockup swung shut. In the eyes of the law, she was no longer a high school senior. She was a defendant, and the investigation was about to move from the slow world of paper files into the high-stakes arena of early forensic science. The discovery was over. The investigation had its suspect. But as the town of Northbrook retreated behind locked doors, the biological witness on that pink sweatshirt was about to tell a story that no one, not the police, not the media, and certainly not the jury, was prepared to hear. The neon pink Esprit sweatshirt. In the fall of 1987, that single garment was more than a fashion statement. It was a symbol of suburban aspiration. It was the kind of piece a girl like Elena Vance wore to mall hangouts or football games to signal she was part of the choice crowd. But by the time the Northbrook detectives pulled it off the clothesline in the Vance backyard, the sweatshirt had been transformed. It was no longer a sign of social status. It was a silent biological witness. When the detectives first held the fabric, they noticed the stiff, starched feel of a frantic wash. Elena had tried to scrub away the night of August 14, yet in the world of forensics, total erasure is a myth. The search for the truth moved from the humid lakefront to the sterile, brightly lit confines of the regional crime lab. This was a moment when forensic science was standing at a massive precipice. For decades, the gold standard had been ABO blood grouping. This system was reliable but possessed limited discriminatory power. If a blood stain on Elena's sweatshirt matched Marcus Thorne's blood type, type A, it wouldn't actually prove it was his. In 1987, type A blood was found in nearly 49% of the general population. The defense could easily argue that the stain came from a nosebleed, a scraped knee, or a dozen other mundane accidents. The prosecution knew that to get a conviction under the new, rigid sentencing guidelines, they needed something that could narrow the odds from 1 in 2 to 1 in several million. We are at the forensic turning point of this investigation. If you think the science of the 80s was enough to seal Elena's fate, drop a guilty in the comments. If you think the tech was too primitive for a life sentence, drop a not guilty. I want to see where the community stands on this evidence. That was when the lead prosecutor made a radical call. He decided to send the sweatshirt to a private laboratory in Maryland, one of the few facilities in the country experimenting with a brand new technique known as DNA profiling or DNA fingerprinting. In 1987, this wasn't the swift digital process we see on modern television. The initial technique, known as restriction fragment length polymorphism, or RFLP, was a labor-intensive marathon. It required a biological deposit at least the size of a quarter. The process involved toxic reagents like phenol and chloroform and could take 6 to 8 weeks to produce a result. Unlike the modern methods that can amplify tiny traces of touch DNA, the scientists in Maryland needed a substantial sample. They were looking for the high molecular weight DNA that hadn't been destroyed by the bleach Elena used in her laundry room. While the lab in Maryland began its slow work, detectives in Northbrook were using another presumptive tool, luminol. They brought Elena's white 1987 Ford Escort into the police garage and turned off the lights. The garage became a cavern of total darkness. Then, they sprayed the chemical onto the passenger seat. The result was an eerie, shimmering blue glow. In the late analog era, a luminol reaction was a dramatic visual for a jury, but its scientific weight was hotly debated. Luminol didn't just react to blood, it could trigger a false positive for copper, iron, bleach, or even certain plant peroxidases. The blue light proved that something had happened in that car, but it couldn't tell the detectives if they were looking at a violent struggle or a spilled bottle of household cleaner. Back in the interrogation room, the pressure on Elena was intensifying. She sat across from the lead detective, the Panasonic portable cassette recorder between them. The hiss of the magnetic tape felt like a physical presence in the room. The detective played the microcassette from her Tandy Duophone answering machine over and over. He wanted her to hear the clink of the coins and the distorted voice of Marcus Thorne calling from that payphone. "The science is catching up to you, Elena," the detective said, leaning into her personal space. "We have the sweatshirt, we have the car, we have the tape. In 1987, you can't run from the double helix." Elena's managed face began to fracture. She used the powerless language of a frightened teenager, her voice cracking as she described how she had pushed Marcus away. She claimed he was hurting her, a defense that mirrored the rough sex narrative used in the Robert Chambers trial a year earlier. But the detectives weren't interested in her victimhood. They were building a narrative of the super predator, a girl who used her preppy status as a shield while she committed a cold-blooded act. By the end of October, the report from the Maryland lab arrived via a clattering teletype machine. The DNA match was a high degree of probability. The odds that the blood on the neon pink Esprit sweatshirt belonged to anyone other than Marcus Thorne were 1 in several million. To the prosecution, this was the smoking gun. They had successfully linked the girl next door to the body in the reeds using a technology that most people in Northbrook didn't even understand. The media circus began to swell. The lakefront homicide was no longer a local story. It was a national referendum on juvenile culpability. And the nightly news showed grainy 35mm photos of the sweatshirt and the escort, framing Elena as the ice princess of the suburbs. The public legal consciousness was being shaped by these mediated images, turning the procedural reality into a narrative myth of a girl who had traded her childhood for a life sentence. As the trial date approached, the town of Northbrook felt like a genetic panopticon. Everyone was watching, everyone was judging, and the science of 1987 seemed to have delivered a final, undeniable verdict. But as the defense team began their own deep dive into the forensic files, they noticed a second, smaller stain on the cuff of that pink sweatshirt, a stain that the Maryland lab had overlooked in their rush to find a match for Marcus Thorne. And that second stain was about to change everything. It was a trace of biological evidence that didn't belong to the victim, and it didn't belong to the defendant. It belonged to someone who was supposed to be the protector of the peace in Northbrook. The stage for the trial was set. The visual justice of the cameras was ready. And the neon pink sweatshirt, the star witness of the prosecution, was about to tell a story of a betrayal so deep it would shatter the pastoral peace of the suburbs forever. The heavy oak doors of the Rockingham County Superior Court swing open, and the silence of the hallway is replaced by the low, electric hum of a room under surveillance. It is October 1987. The air inside the courtroom is stagnant, carrying the faint scent of floor wax and the metallic tang of clunky electronic equipment. This is the arena where the life of 17-year-old Elena Vance will be decided. And for the first time in the history of this jurisdiction, the world is watching through a lens. The physical environment is a study in transition. Traditional wood-paneled walls and the heavy architecture of formality stand in sharp contrast to the tangle of thick black cables snaking across the floor. These cables lead to static position cameras, experimental boxes brought in to broadcast the proceedings to a public increasingly saturated by crime fiction and tabloid news. Elena Vance sits at the mahogany defense table, her presence a focal point for what theorists call visual justice. She is the aesthetic and symbolic construction of a defendant, a girl whose every blink is indexed by the jury and the viewing public as either a sign of virtue or a mark of criminality. Elena's appearance is meticulously managed. She wears a teal blazer with exaggerated shoulder pads, a style emblematic of the suburban middle class in 1987. Her hair is permed into a rigid, voluminous crown. This managed face is her only shield against the evil woman hypothesis being crafted by the prosecution. The state argues that by allegedly committing this homicide, Elena has violated every gender norm of passive femininity. They don't see a frightened child. They see a calculative actor who traded her innocence for a life of deviance. The prosecutor stands before the jury, his voice projected with the confidence of a man who knows the cameras are rolling. He utilizes a large projection screen, a rare and high-tech addition for 1987, to display grainy 35mm photos of the neon pink Esprit sweatshirt. He calls it the pink proof of her guilt. He describes the struggle at the docks not as a tragic accident, but as a premeditated act of a super predator. He leans into the socio-cultural anxiety of the year, suggesting that if a girl from a choice neighborhood like Northbrook could do this, then no one is safe. Elena's defense team tries to counter this narrative with the chivalry branch of judicial paternalism. They want the jury to see Elena's powerless language, the hesitations in her voice, the way she looks at the floor, as proof of her vulnerability. Her lawyer argues that Elena was a victim of a dysfunctional attachment to Marcus Thorne. He suggests that the lakefront homicide was a release of human tension, a drama fueled by the sweltering heat of August 14 rather than criminal intent. The climax of the trial comes when the prosecution calls their forensic expert to the stand. In 1987, the double helix is still a mystery to the average citizen. The expert explains the restriction fragment length polymorphism process, or RFLP, using a clunky overhead projector. He shows a series of dark bands on a transparency, the DNA fingerprint from the pink sweatshirt. He tells the jury that the probability of the blood belonging to anyone other than Marcus Thorne is 1 in several million. The courtroom is silent as the statistical framework of the match is laid out. The defense attempts to challenge the expert, either arguing that the technology is a genetic panopticon and that the interpretation of DNA mixtures is prone to human error and bias. They point out that the lab in Maryland is one of only a few in the country, and there are no national standards yet to verify these results. But in the climate of 1987, the lure of certain science is powerful. The jury looks at the dark bands on the screen and then at the girl in the teal blazer. The biological witness seems to have spoken. But the trial is not just about the law, it is a performance. The trial by media infrastructure means that every gesture Elena makes is analyzed on the nightly news. The media has branded her the Ice Princess, a label that creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because she doesn't cry on cue, because she maintains her managed face under the flicker of the television lights, the public assumes she is cold-blooded. The procedural reality is being stripped away, leaving only a narrative myth of a girl who traded her pom-poms for a life sentence. As the judge calls for a recess, the human tension in the room is a physical weight. Elena is led out by the bailiffs, her shoulder pads casting a long, distorted shadow against the wood paneling. The experimental broadcast cuts to a commercial, but the spectacular punishment continues in the minds of the viewers. The pastoral peace of Northbrook is gone, replaced by a legal consciousness shaped by mediated images and the emerging power of the double helix. The prosecution believes they have won. They have the sweatshirt, the car, the DNA, and the haunting microcassette tape. They believe the verdict is already written in the magnetic tape and the biological stains. Yet as the defense prepares for their final witness, they are holding a piece of paper that was buried at the bottom of the crime lab's file. A note about a second, smaller stain on the cuff of that pink sweatshirt. The visual justice of the cameras is about to capture a moment that no one in that courtroom, not the judge, not the prosecutor, and certainly not the viewers at home, could have predicted. The story of August 14th is about to be rewritten, and the true meaning of the word guilty is about to be revealed in the most visceral way possible. The trial of Elena Vance was supposed to be a slam dunk for the prosecution. They had the science of the double helix, the biological witness of the neon pink sweatshirt, and a public legal consciousness that had already decided 17 was old enough to be guilty. But as the defense calls its final witness, an independent forensic consultant who looks like he hasn't slept since 1986, the electric hum of the cameras feels like it's about to short-circuit the room. The consultant doesn't look at the jury. He looks at a single piece of paper, a laboratory supplemental report that had been buried under a mountain of manual filing and carbon copy teletype sheets. He adjusted his glasses and leaned into the microphone. "We all saw the dark bands on the projection screen," he began, his voice flat and clinical. "We all saw the match for Marcus Thorne's blood on the front of the sweatshirt, but the state lab ignored the cuff. There was a second, a smaller stain, a microscopic deposit of epithelial cells that the restriction fragment length polymorphism test initially missed because they were looking for a victim, not a second actor." The courtroom fell into a silence so heavy it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Elena's managed face finally cracked. A single tear tracked through the heavy layer of base makeup she had been wearing since the trial began. The expert continued, his words hitting the room like physical blows. "We ran a newer, more sensitive probe on that cuff. The DNA profile does not belong to Marcus Thorne, and it certainly does not belong to Elena Vance. The profile belongs to a direct paternal match to the defendant. It belongs to the man who has been sitting in the front row of this trial every single day. It belongs to Police Chief Vance." The pop flash of the 35mm cameras exploded in the gallery. Chief Vance, a pillar of the Northbrook community, a man who had been praised for his tough-on-crime stance throughout the sweltering summer of 1987, didn't move. He sat as rigid as the wood-paneled walls behind him. The narrative of August 14 began to dissolve and reform in the minds of everyone watching the experimental broadcast. The lakefront homicide was not a story of a super predator girl and a waste toy dropout. It was a story of a desperate escape. The defense team presented the reconstructed timeline. Marcus Thorne hadn't been an aggressor. He was a protector. Well, he was the only person in Northbrook who knew the truth about what was happening behind the manicured lawn of the Vance household. On the night of August 14, Elena hadn't sneaked out to kill Marcus. She had sneaked out because Marcus had promised to take her and her younger siblings away from their father's abuse. The struggle at the boathouse was real, but the flash of neon pink wasn't a sign of Elena's violence. It was a sign of her being restrained. Chief Vance had followed them in his department cruiser, a vehicle that moved through the shadows of Northbrook with total impunity. He had used the procedural opacity of the era to his advantage. He knew the police radios were on different frequencies. He knew the teletype machines were slow. He caught them at the docks, and in a frantic release of human tension, he had pushed Marcus Thorne into the dark water. But the betrayal went deeper than a single act of violence. Chief Vance had used his position as the protector of the peace to frame his own daughter. He used the manual record-keeping system to alter Marcus Thorne's juvenile history, turning a few status offenses into a narrative of a dangerous thug. He ensured the investigation moved with a self-fulfilling prophecy, directing the detectives toward the pink sweatshirt he knew was stained. He had counted on the trial-by-media infrastructure to brand Elena as the Ice Princess, knowing that if the public saw her as a monster, they would never look at him. Elena's silence, the powerless language that the prosecution had used to prove her guilt, was her final act of protection. She hadn't stayed silent to save herself. She had stayed silent because her father had told her that if she spoke, her younger siblings would be the next ones to fall into Blackwood Lake. As the experts stepped down, the visual justice of the cameras caught Chief Vance standing up. He didn't look like a hero anymore. He looked like a man trapped in a genetic panopticon of his own making. The science of 1987 had done what the community of Northbrook couldn't. It had looked past the teal blazer and the shoulder pads to find the biological truth buried in the fabric. The judge called for an immediate sidebar, but the damage was done. The lakefront homicide was over, and the trial of the century had just become a referendum on the very system that had tried to bury a 17-year-old girl in an adult penitentiary. Elena Vance was guilty, not of murder, but of a desperate, terrifying silence. And as the cameras rolled, the world finally saw the monster that had been hiding in plain sight behind a badge and a managed face. The sweltering heat of August 14 was gone, replaced by the cold, hard light of forensic reality. The secret was out. The silent witness had spoken. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut around the wrists of Chief Vance was a different kind of mechanical snap than the ones heard earlier in this trial. It wasn't the rhythmic click of a Tandy Duophone resetting or the hiss of a Panasonic tape recorder. This was the sound of the system finally turning its teeth toward the predator it had protected all summer. As the bailiffs led the chief out of the Rockingham County Superior Court, the clunky experimental cameras followed his every step. And the visual justice of 1987 was now focused on the man who had authored the lie, stripping away his badge in front of a live television audience. In the wake of the forensic reveal, the courtroom was a site of total upheaval. The prosecutor, who had spent weeks painting Elena as a cold-blooded actor, stood at his mahogany table with a face like curdled milk. The narrative of the Ice Princess had dissolved in the span of a single expert testimony. Elena Vance didn't look like a super predator anymore. As she watched her father being led away, the managed face she had maintained since August 14 was gone. She looked like exactly what she was, a 17-year-old girl who had been carrying the weight of a monster's secrets while the world screamed for her execution. The Northbrook community didn't recover quickly. The pastoral peace they had tried so hard to protect had been a facade. The fear of crime that had gripped the town all summer was revealed to be a weapon used by the very person they trusted to keep them safe. The news media, ever the architect of panic, pivoted within the hour. The nightly news stories that had once focused on the lakefront homicide as a sign of juvenile deviance now began a deep dive into the Vance betrayal. The irony of 1987 was that the same trial-by-media infrastructure that had almost buried Elena was now the only thing documenting her father's fall from grace. On the steps of the courthouse, the defense attorney addressed a forest of microphones. He spoke about the procedural opacity that had allowed Chief Vance to frame Marcus Thorne. He explained how the chief had used the manual record-keeping systems and the slow speed of the teletype machines to create a false history for Marcus, making him the perfect scapegoat. Marcus Thorne wasn't a wastoid or a thug. He was a 19-year-old dropout who was the only person brave enough to stand between a powerful man and a terrified girl. Elena was released from custody that evening. She walked out of the county lockup wearing the same teal blazer with the exaggerated shoulder pads she had worn to the trial. But as she stepped into the crisp October air, she looked different. The shoulder pads didn't look like a costume anymore. They looked like a burden she was finally allowed to set down. Her younger siblings were waiting for her in a station wagon driven by her aunt. And the silence she had maintained, the powerless language the state had mocked, had served its purpose. Her siblings were safe. The monster was in a cage of his own making. The legal legacy of not old enough, but guilty remains a complex chapter in American history. The case hit the headlines just as the federal sentencing guidelines took effect on November 1st, 1987. These rules, designed to be tough on crime, had almost resulted in a child being sentenced to a life term in an adult penitentiary based on a lie constructed by authority. The Vance trial forced a nation to look at the genetic panopticon of early DNA profiling and realize that science is only as honest as the people who process the files. It served as a warning that in the rush to treat children like adults, we risk losing the ability to see the victims hiding behind the managed faces of the accused. Marcus Thorne was eventually cleared of all posthumous charges. A small memorial was placed at the Blackwood Lake docks, not for a victim of a super predator, but for a young man who died a hero in a neon pink sweatshirt. The sweatshirt itself was never returned to the Vance family. It remains in a state evidence locker, a silent biological witness to the summer the rules changed. As we look back at the sweltering heat of that August heat wave, we see a year of incredible strife and transition. 1987 was the year the super predator myth was born, but for the town of Northbrook, it was the year the myth was unmasked. Elena Vance is an adult now, living far from the manicured lawns and the blinking red lights of answering machines. She remains a symbol of a generation that was told they were not old enough for mercy, but guilty enough for the cage. The story of August 14th reminds us that the truth is often buried under layers of analog static and social hierarchy. It reminds us that justice is not just about the verdict in a courtroom. It is about the courage to speak when the world wants you to stay silent. The Justice Minute is dedicated to uncovering these vaults of history, ensuring that the voices of the innocent are never lost in the shuffle of a manual filing system. Thank you for sticking with us through this visceral journey into the dark side of 1987. If this investigation moved you, hit that like button and share this video with one person who believes in the power of truth. If you haven't yet, join the Justice Minute community by hitting subscribe. Your support allows us to keep digging into the cases the world tried to forget. I will see you in the next minute of justice.